People often say that the last project you make is often your favourite project. Well, I've got to say this time, it's right. I'm starting here with a piece of oak. It's roughly 50mm by 40mm and about 300mm long. Just truing this up between centres and then turn a small tenon on the end so that it will fit onto my O'Donnell jaws. Once it's in the jaws, I drill a 10.3mm hole as deep as I can get it. I'm working from plans here. I then mark out all the major points on the blank. The finish length for the cannon barrel will be 196mm long with a maximum diameter of 35mm. On each of the points I'm taking down to size, I mainly use the parting tool and set the size with calipers. And then I do any shaping with either my Ashley Isles 12mm spindle gouge or Ashley Isles skew. I'm regularly stopping, taking more precise measurements with the vernier calipers. Working to more precise measurements for a complete project is something totally new to me, and this was the main reason why this project actually took me so long to make. Plans I have are all scalable up to different sizes of cannons, and they cover anything from a 4-pound cannon right the way up to a 42-pound cannon. Plans I'm actually working from is based on a 12-pound cannon which has a 4.4-inch bore in it. I've gone for a 10.3mm bore on mine purely simply because I had that drill bit from what I used for some pen blanks, and that works out roughly about 1/10 to 1/11 scale of the original. With having to be so precise on all of these measurements and sizing and everything, I really was taking my time on this. I certainly didn't want to make any mistakes and have to repeat the whole process again. With all the shaping now completed, I then put on my indexing jig, and the reason for this is I need to make 2 holes that are totally in line with each other along the barrel. These will hold the trunnions. Now the trunnions are what the barrel swivels on when it's connected to the carriage. After that's done, I then sand everything down to 320 grit and give it a coat of my ebonizing solution. When it's dry, I then sand it back to 320 grit again before applying another coat of ebonizing solution. I'll repeat this through the 400 and 600 grit so that when the final coat of ebonizing solution is applied, the grain will not rise anymore, just leaving a nice smooth surface. This is how I then deal with all the ebonizing later on as well. With the main part of the cannon now all finished, I then need to turn the trunnions. Where these join onto the barrel, they need to be slightly oversized to cover any gapping that's made from the holes. Because you're fitting a cylinder onto a cylinder, the edges also need to be shaped as well, so that they follow the curve of the barrel. I use exactly the same process for the ebonizing as I did with the actual main cannon. The next job is to make the trucks, or wheels as we'd more commonly know them as. The front trucks on the carriage are actually larger than the rear ones. They're all turned to the same thickness, also require the same 10.3mm bore to fit onto the axles. Making these is a quick and easy job after the cannon barrel. With the trucks finished, I then move on to the axles. Now, both axles are actually slightly different, but I use the same process for making them both. Using a large enough piece of oak, the round ends are all turned down and shaped as required, where the square inner part will then be cut away on the bandsaw later on. The sides of the carriage are actually called a bracket, and what I've done here is I've used two pieces of oak that I've already cut to size on the bandsaw, taped them together with some double-sided tape, and then covered it with masking tape. I can then mark out the pattern on the masking tape to what I need to cut out on the bandsaw. Moving over to the bandsaw, it's a quick and easy job to cut these out. After all the bracket is done, I then start cutting down both of the axles. After the bracket's done and the axles are done, I then move on to the transom. Now, the transom is the part which the cannon will rest on. Also, just the last two pieces to be done are the bolster and the stall bed. With all the pieces cut out, I then just sand everything back. Then I just do a dry run assembly, and I can finish sanding out the notches for where the trunnions will sit, just to make sure that they spin freely. After that, the final piece to make is the rod which holds the rear end of the carriage together. I make this a lot longer than is actually required, so that at least when I've got it fitted into the bracket, I can then sand off both the ends. For the brackets, the holes for the rod, I drill these out carefully on the pillar drill at the required angle. With that all now assembled, I can then just do the final bit of shaping on the stall bed. Now all the pieces are made, I can now give the whole of the carriage a coat of sanding sealer. When the sanding sealer is all dried, sand it all back, and then I give it a coat of wax. Here I'm using the Bry Wax Dark Oak. The main reason for using this wax is just the effect that it gives the oak. It really does make it look like an old piece of wood. With everything waxed now, I then sand back the pieces where I need to glue together and start assembling the bracket onto the two axles. While that's drying, I then decide to go off and turn some cannonballs. Back to the assembly again, and the next job is then to glue in the transom. I then just go and give the cannonball some ebonizing solution. Then it's glue on the other side of the bracket. Once that's dry, I can then feed in the rod and glue that in place. With that dry, I can then glue in the bolster. Once everything's dry again, I can then sand off the end of the rods so that they're flush with the sides of the brackets. I don't know what these are actually called, but these are going to be little brackets that sit over the top of the trunnions and attach to the brackets so that it holds the cannon in place. I shape the grooves out with my rotary tool and then cut the shape out on the scroll saw. Once that's done, I'll then just sand them all up with the rotary tool just to finalise the shape a bit. Now that I'm actually happy with how everything fits together, I can then glue the trunnions onto the actual barrel of the cannon. For the brackets that hold the cannon in place, I'm using silver gilt cream. Now that I've finished doing all the modifications on the actual carriage, I can then just give it one more final coat of wax before I then glue in place the stall bed. Last thing to turn is some form of pins to hold the wheels in place once they're set on the axles. So once I've got them turned, I then just place the wheels onto the axles, mark out where I need to drill some holes, tailor across to the pillar drill, drill all the holes. For the pins, I also again give them a coat of wax so that they fit in with the colouring of the carriage. For the two little silver brackets, I give them a coat of matte varnish just to help protect them from wear and tear, and the main cannon body is given a gloss varnish. The O-rings I'm using on the side of the carriage, the ones I bought, they are really shiny and wouldn't have looked right going straight on the cannon. But what I found was that if you actually heat these up so that they're glowing red a couple of times and let them cool down, they all oxidise and lose all their shiny part. Just gently sanding them back, and I think that they look a lot better. The final part of assembly then is fixing all the eye hooks in, fixing the brackets on that hold the cannon in place, and putting the trucks on. I decided I wanted to create a base for this to sit on, and I used another piece of oak board that I've got. I also wanted to make this look like a bit like a ship's deck, so using my router table, I put in lots of long lines on there and then used the rotary tool to create the ends of to make it look like it's a piece of planks. I didn't want to apply the same wax that I'd used on the carriage for this. I wanted it to be more contrasting to the whole of the cannon. I'd got some of these walnut crystals that I'd bought. I gave it a go for the first time and I was really pleased with the result. It's probably a little bit darker than I'd probably liked. Because the base is dark, the cannonballs just would have been lost on there if I'd have glued them in place, so I used a very small piece of plywood, cut out a circle just so that they've got something to sit on. Hello there, it's Paul here and welcome along everyone. A totally different project for me this time. I've got to say this has probably took me around about 2 weeks on and off to do this one. I think the main reason was that because I was working on precise measurements, I was taking a lot more time just to make sure everything was right. That is basically what I've been working off. So you've got all detailed measurements for everything. The whole thing can be scaled up. There's different measurements for different size cannons, for things like 4 pounders, 6 pounders, 9 pounders. Mine, I think, is based around the 12 pound cannon, and where the bore of the actual cannon should be around about 4.4 inches. Now I've done mine on 10.3 mil, so I mean, go off and do the maths, but I think you'll find that it means I'm probably round about 1/8 of a scale, probably slightly bigger. For the ebonizing, I wanted to keep this to show it as wood. I could quite have easily sprayed it black and you wouldn't have seen anything, but I wanted to keep that wood feel there, so I went for my ebonizing solution, and that was another reason why I went for oak, because oak does really take to the ebonizing solution well. But again, like with all things with wood, the moment you put any moisture on them, all the grain fuzzes up. So what I did on here was I'd sanded it something like about 240, 320, something like that. Gave it a coat of ebonizing solution, resanded it back down with that grit after it had dried out. Applied another coat of the ebonizing solution, let it dry, sanded it down and the next grit up, and I went through all the grits there. So by the time I did the 320, 400, 600, and after I'd sanded it back on 600, I then gave it another coat of ebonizing solution, and it was just as smooth as anything. My next major issue was the trunnions, which is these pieces on the side here that the barrel effectively swivels on. And because you're putting a cylinder into a cylinder, you can't just have a straightforward round end. So I then had to carve out the curves to try and get them fitting as best as I possibly could. Cutting the carriage out, I found a piece of scrap oak I'd got from what I picked up from quite a while ago. Had to stick it through my planer thickener to get it down to the required diameter. Effectively just used a bit of tape just to put the two pieces together, so that when I cut them on the bandsaw, I got two sides that were identical. For the actual base stand here, I wanted something that looked old again, worn, a bit like a ship's decking. I routed all the slots down there. This wasn't my initial plan to start with, the colouring. I was going to have all the slots down there. I was going to use then my rotary tool to put, usually sort of like where the end of the planks finish. Initially I was going to literally lower this area here totally for the whole thing to sit in, but in the end I thought it was just far better to put these little grooves in there for the cannon to sit in. And I was going to use properly like this with the dark oak again. I thought having a totally different colour for the base then would be a lot more contrasting. So with the walnut crystals, first time I'd ever used them, I knew it was just a case of mixing them in water. So I put some in there and I did my test piece and I was quite happy with it, but when I applied it to this, it came out a lot darker than I expected. So ideally it just needed to be watered down a lot more. Now the good thing about this stuff is that, I mean, if I just leave this somewhere, it's going to dry out eventually, and I can just add water back to it again to use it again, so you don't really get much wastage. I left this to dry overnight, the base. I then just went over this with something like 240 or 320 grit sandpaper. It took it back nice and smooth. It's still got the texture there, and I then just put wood wax 22 over the top of it just to try and give it that little bit of a sheen to it. It's still dull in places, but it just looks more natural. And to me, I mean, I don't know whether it'll actually show on the camera or not when I turn it around, it's got that oldie feel to it. Because I'd done the base so dark, the cannonballs weren't going to contrast enough with the base. That would have been lost if I'd have just glued these straight to the base. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next project video.